Well, hello and welcome again to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit. This is a lectionary-based preaching resource that likes to relate next Sunday's readings to what's going on in the world. My name is Michael Wakelin. I worked for the BBC for many years, and I'm now Executive Chair of the Religion Media Centre, Executive Producer of Pause for Thought on Radio 2, and a founding partner of the Religion and Belief Literacy Partnership. But as usual, I'm delighted to say that I'm not the one providing the wisdom for this week's podcast. That is in the form of Jo Cox-Darling, who's Superintendent Minister of the Wolverhampton Methodist Circuit. She's also chair of the Mission Committee. And she describes herself as someone who continues to help the church notice what God is up to, which I want to come back to, and also author of Finding God in a Culture of Fear, which I also want to come back to too. So welcome, Jo. Very nice to have you with us.
Lovely to be here, Michael.
And I should say you're also a contributor to Pause for Thought, like several other contributors to this podcast over recent weeks. Do you enjoy doing Pause for Thought?
I really do. In fact, I recorded one this morning with Owen with Evans, so I'm a little bleary-eyed from that, but I love the opportunity of being able to communicate creatively and well early in the morning to such a wide and diverse audience.
I was going to say, when you said record, you mean actual live broadcast at
I,
5:45.
it was 5:45. It was a live broadcast this morning.
And it goes out to about 1 million people. So that's
So you tell me.
probably a few more than you have in your congregation.
There's a few more zeros there, yeah.
So you talk about helping Christians to notice what God is up to. What is he up to at the moment? Because the world's in quite a bad state.
The world is really burdensome at the moment, isn't it? And I think being a Methodist as well can be a place where we are just tired by some of the stories of decline and some of the challenges that we're facing. But actually, noticing God in some of the smaller things is really exciting. So last week I was with an ecumenical community and we were walking around farmland praying for God to bless the harvests and the all of the industries and the agriculture that was there. And then we walked onto a farm that had suffered quite a horrific accident and said, actually, even in the midst of trauma, there is still hope and healing and God's presence. Simon Sinek talks about what it is to sit in the mud with people for a few minutes. And I think actually quite a lot of the time, God is sitting in the mud with us and enabling us to dust ourselves off again and notice those glimpses of grace and glory and hope that just give us the energy to keep on looking outwards and upwards.
I love the Private Eye cartoon, which shows God and an angel looking down on the earth, and the angel saying to God, "Have you tried turning it off and on?"
It does feel like that sometimes, doesn't it?
You're doing a bit of a reset, it feels.
It does feel a little bit like that, and yet the spirit is still at work in so many different ways and in so many different places. It's easy to get despondent, but actually sometimes we don't need words to explain it. We need open hearts to receive what God is up to and to live in a way that enables people to know just how loved they are.
I first met you when you came to the Methodist Summer Fellowship as our Bible study leader for the week, and you talked about finding God in a culture of fear. I wonder if you could, it's a very unfair question, but in just a minute or so, just to sum up some of your key messages around your series of talks around that subject, finding God in a culture of fear.
Yeah, that was all based on that book that I wrote with BRF. And it was a way, actually pre-COVID, of trying to explore some of the challenges we find when this exhausting, burdensome, traumatic world leaves us exhausted and all out. And actually, what is it for us to lean deeper into the gospel, to lean deeper into God's love, to live deeper together in a way that actually brings about God's kingdom and helps us to reveal more of God's hope. So the book has a few embarrassing stories from me, but actually is largely about engaging the theology of hope in a way that's really grounded in people's experience and expressions throughout the UK and slightly wider as well. What is it to be on this journey, this adventure of grace with God in a way that transforms the world for the better?
So this podcast is all about helping preachers prepare for Sunday. What's your routine for preparing to preach on a Sunday? How do you set about it?
So I will often start with the lectionary passages, see whether there's kind of things that are starting to brew there, and that will happen probably late on a Monday for the following Sunday. I try and look at the text a little bit earlier on. Um, and then I carry around a notebook, and so stuff gets scribbled in there, and ideas get flicked on my phone, and hymns kind of pop up, or I kind of look on the Methodist website for hymn suggestions if I'm struggling. So by about Thursday, I've got a complete structure. But then it'll take a couple of days just to refine how I then go about sorting out both a sermon, and I try and have something of a grounded response as well. I think having ritual responses is really helpful, especially when services can be quite wordy. Taking away the words, letting people sit in some space, some silence with some images can be really helpful as well. So that will happen kind of into the weekend for me. All of that, I try and find other voices for me to engage with as well. So the politics and the pulpit resources here, but also trying to make sure that I take ideas and resources from other parts of the world and other theological persuasions that I'm less in tune with, just to make sure that I'm helping as many people as possible to hear something of God's goodness in the midst of it.
I haven't had a contributor yet who thinks that politics shouldn't play a part in the pulpit. And this particular week, with the big news arriving on Thursday about the general election, means you can't really avoid politics in the pulpit. What can we say about the election realistically, which is going to be helpful to our congregations?
I'm really thrilled with the JPIT resources around Love, Pray, Vote. That actually make sure that there is space to be tender-hearted. We can't avoid talking about the election, and we can't avoid talking about how society is impacted by whatever happens on the 4th of July. But to do that faithfully and prayerfully, and to enable each other to see something of potential in all of the campaigning going on, I think will be really, really important. I was really struck when I was preparing for this and thinking about how divisive, or how divided, I guess, some of my congregations and some family members were in 2019 over the Brexit votes. And I just wonder whether there's something at the moment where we're kind of similarly frightened about what might happen if we even start to talk about politics and elections at the moment. And my hunch is that it's a combination of that experience in 2019, but also that we haven't grappled quite long enough yet with what it means to have gone through COVID. When the world got as bad as it could be, we actually locked all our doors and stopped being communities. And we haven't yet worked out how to be community again, how to live for each other again, how to be good neighbours again. And this election just feels as if, at the moment for me at least, that sense of we're frightened of what the future holds, just because I don't yet know who my neighbour is anymore. I was told to be scared of them for so long. I remember I went to a shop and I was told to leave because I took my toddler. We were so frightened of each other, so frightened of difference, told to be fearful of even our parents or our grandchildren, that anything that risks bringing any sort of fissure or break into society just seems to be terrifying. Yeah. So I guess for me, the encouragement that I keep leaning into is that we live in hope. that actually part of our prophetic response is not to fuel the fear, but to fuel what it is to be confident, to lean towards each other, not away from each other, and to see what we can learn in the midst of that, and to see where the kingdom of God is in the midst of that as well. What does a just society look like this side of the kingdom rather than the other side of a voting ballot?
Well, yeah, and hope can be very painful, can't it? There's the famous line from that John Cleese film, isn't there? Despair, I can deal with the despair. It's the hope I can't stand. I mean, we have great hope. We are prisoners of hope, as we're called as Christians.
Yeah, and living for another can cost us everything, which is our gospel account as well. It's what we learn with Jesus. It can cost everything, and yet it gains the kingdom.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention to the readings that are set for this Sunday. I know you've been busy preparing on all of them, so I can throw them at you in any order. But maybe first of all, have you found a theme that will link them all together? Because that can sometimes be quite difficult.
What I've found in these texts, I think there is something really deep within these that speak both about the nature of God, but also about the nature of humanity, what it is to value humans humanely.
Mm.
Um, and it's worth saying that the Sunday, June the 2nd, is World Environment Sunday,
Yeah.
comes just after World Environment Day the following week as well. There's not a lot in these texts which are about creation and creation care, but there's an awful lot about God's ongoing transformative love for the whole of God's people. So for me, it's about valuing human beings for who they are, as wonder-filled as we're going to get to, and worthy and called, and encountering God in all sorts of different spaces.
And setting up that theme, the psalm is a very good place to start.
I thought you were going to start there. Yes, Michael.
Psalm 139 is our reading. It's verses 1 to 6 and then 13 to 18. What leaps at you from this text?
I've just used the phrase of being wonder filled. You search me and you know me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I just love that sense of wonder, that joyous mysteriousness that enables us to realize that individually we are wonderful. And actually, how hard that is to say. I'm staring at a Zoom screen now with myself looking at me, and that you are wonderful. I am wonderful. That abundance and that kind of countercultural self-image stuff, but also then to offer that into society as well. You are wonderful. You are to be lost in wonder and praise, and that in itself is an incredibly powerful thing. Whatever your age or your gender, your income, your health status, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we're woven into God's story.
There's a bit at the beginning which is interesting in the way God keeps an eye on us. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways, which is a little bit frightening in some ways. But yeah, it's a real sense of God's closeness to us, I suppose.
God's closeness, maybe something of God's acceptance as well. I mean, quite often we're spending all sorts of, or doing all sorts of things to our appearance, and actually God delights with us wherever we are, whatever we look like, whether our wrinkle cream is working or whatever is going on inside of our heads and our hearts as well. There's a real intimacy to this passage.
Let's stay with the Hebrew scriptures and look at the reading from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 10.
Yeah.
This is, well, God calling Samuel. Is this a favourite of yours?
I think it used to be a favourite of mine, and then I got old. And I think that there is something in this passage, isn't there, about how God speaks to young people. Um, and there is so much that's just heartbreaking about Eli. So Eli was told in verse 2 that his eyesight had grown so dim he could not see. And some commentators reflect that actually there's a dual meaning there. It could be that he literally could not see, but as a priest, it could also be that he'd lost that spark, that spiritual intuition that actually he was no longer hearing God. And that's just heartbreakingly awful to kind of imagine this circumstance, where one of the most faithful people was actually struggling potentially with faithlessness or listlessness or apathy. So what we have here then is a statesperson offering a young person a way to see God on their terms, which is just such a powerful thing when we think of, I guess, many of our churches. How often do we have this intergenerational ministry where older statespeople are given the opportunity to enable young people to hear God in the way that God is speaking to them, not to the old person? And that changing power dynamic is incredibly risky and transformative and heartbreaking and bittersweet. Quite often I'm involved in conversations. So when are the children of Messy Church going to come on a Sunday? When are the parade services going to lead to a new Sunday school? And actually this passage says that God is speaking to our young people in ways that our young people hear, and leading them into a new place and a new understanding of their faith. Many of us, I think, also probably came to faith as children, and it can be really guilt-inducing that maybe some of our families are no longer in church alongside us. And I think there's some confidence here that we can take that says, actually, we don't need to feel guilty about that. God is still speaking to our family members. God is still speaking to younger generations and older generations on their terms. And faith may look different to them. Faithful communities may look different to them. And that's okay, because God is still speaking. So let's keep our ears and our eyes and our hearts as open and as tender as we possibly can.
I took a service nearby here a couple of weeks ago, and they didn't just have a messy church, they had a muddy church.
Oh, they're fab, aren't they?
Well, it enabled me to talk about Peppa Pig, which was a great delight. In this reading, I'm always slightly scared by the idea that the Lord came and stood there and said, Samuel, Samuel. It's his kind of physical presence almost, which is leapt out at me from this, I must say.
And again, something hugely intimate about that, and terrifying, absolutely terrifying. But again, God coming close in order to speak to the chosen people. When I was reading around this passage as well, I was really struck by the importance of not neglecting our ancestors. Again, it's not necessarily something that in British culture we're used to doing, but actually intergenerationality, that ability to speak to multiple generations at different times, actually leaning into the ancient voices and the traditional voices, enables us then to curate worship that connects us deeper, both in the time and space continuum of God's kingdom.
Can I move you forward to the reading in the New Testament from Corinthians? It's 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 to 12. 2 Corinthians 4, chapter 4, verses 5 to 12. I found this reading very encouraging. It gave me lots of hope, and the idea that we're hard pressed on every side but not crushed. It was a reading that lifted my spirits.
And those middle few verses are really critical, aren't they? That knowing that they've been written by Paul, he was very, very good at crushing, perplexing, and making people fall into despair in his previous life. And then a revelation of Jesus, a commitment to transforming the world through the gospel of good news, proclaiming Jesus Christ as Lord, to be a slave to that gospel rather than to one of despair and confusion and chaos, actually really gives this heft, I think, as a hope-filled passage, that we can feel burdened and we can have this really fear-filled experience at the moment, as we've already said. And yet, because God is who God is, there is light in the midst of all of that, and that there is power because we are not afflicted, we are not despairing, we are not persecuted, not destroyed.
Not abandoned. Yeah.
Wow, and that's just beautiful, isn't it? Not to be abandoned by God,
Yeah.
especially those of us who are feeling fragile or marginalized or caricatured, especially at the moment. We're not left behind, we're not laid asunder. And there's that beautiful phrase as well in this passage about we have treasures in clay jars. I wonder whether a better interpretation of that is that we have treasure in Tupperware boxes. It's about clay jars were used in everything in the ancient world. It contained water, it contained food, it contained olive oil, it had all of the products that you would use in everyday life. It's a normal, ordinary thing. And it's the ordinary, fragile things that contain the greatest blessings, the greatest treasures.
Tupperware containers aren't so biodegradable.
They aren't, but clay jars aren't quite so regularly available in my local supermarket. So it was
True.
trying to get something of the meaning behind what Paul was trying to say there.
Yeah.
There's something fragile and ordinary, and
This,
yet the gospel is extraordinary.
this had a resonance about the story of George Floyd for you.
Well, I've been doing quite a lot of thinking at the moment about I Can't Breathe. So George Floyd died 4 years ago last week. And what is it for us to feel as though we are breathless? What is it for us to realize that we can't always fit in every person's shoes in every story? I am a middle class, white, well educated woman. I am not going to understand quite the experience of some of my colleagues and friends who more closely associate with George Floyd's story. But I can reflect on those times when I have perpetuated somebody else's suffering, when I have stifled somebody else because of my use of power, whether I was aware of it or not. I'm becoming better at knowing when I'm doing it, but I do know quite often how I am able to use power and influence in order to prioritize one voice over another. So what is it for us to breathe again, that spirit that says, actually, my power can be divested elsewhere, that there are other people whose stories are need to be told and need to be amplified and elevated. There are other perspectives that we need to bring around our tables. We need to continue to widen and diversify and create more opportunities for difference around a table, because that's the world that God has called us to. God created this amazing diversity, as we've just read in Psalm 139. The whole world is wonder filled. So, actually, how can we let the Spirit breathe life that doesn't bring confusion and despair and affliction and persecution, but enables those people who feel abandoned, unjustly distanced, or completely stifled by those of us that have more power and influence to take their rightful seat and to find their voice and for their voices to be amplified further.
There's a really strong endorsement of our humanity and our human bodies in this reading from Corinthians, where Paul says we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. It's a very powerful message for me, I think, a very incarnational message.
Absolutely, and those themes of life and death. I'm really struck at the moment where I am. The local council strategy includes enabling everybody in our area to become more competent at talking about death and dying and bereavement over the next 5 years. That actually we've lost something of being able to talk about how dying matters and how to die well and how to be honest about grief and bereavement across all spheres of society. And I think text like this, as you say, it's very incarnational, that actually we don't need to be frightened of death. We need to be able to embody death and decay and to talk about suffering in a way that enables us also to talk about the hope that we have in Jesus.
And finally, our gospel reading is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, 20 to 23 to chapter 3, verse 6. Mark 2, 23 to chapter 3, verse 6. And I love this. It's Jesus being the rebel and breaking the rules, which I think we ought to pay more heed to sometimes. Would this be your controlling reading, do you think, for the week?
I'm not sure that it would, if I'm honest, because I think that I would probably do an Old Testament lean to encourage people to find themselves and to find God's in order to then to love and pray and vote. I'd kind of probably link those a little bit closer together. I read one person that said it takes 79 verses for Jesus to upset people so much in Mark's gospel that he becomes a wanted man.
Yeah.
So this is the switch point in Mark's gospel. The first switch anyway. There's another one in 10 chapters time, but this is 79 verses into Mark's gospel, the switch for Jesus's ministry. It's a fabulous way of kind of going about that rebelliousness. And what I love here is that sense of rebellion in the text doesn't rest on the laws or the expectations of the time. So you kind of have two vignettes, almost two incidences where Jesus upsets people. The first, he's walking through a field and he starts to glean corn, and it happens to be the Sabbath, and it makes it look as if he's working on the Sabbath and thus breaking that fundamental Torah law to keep the Sabbath holy. And then secondly, because he kind of knows that he's upset people by this point in time, he then walks through a cityscape and in this urban environment starts to challenge people a little bit about whether it's okay to feed people and heal people, or whether actually the norms of the day have to be preserved. And actually, I think that there is something for me here that Jesus reaches out and talks to this man who had a withered hand. So it's not a kind of terminal critical thing. It's not an urgent care situation. This is somebody with a life limiting condition, but even in that space, they were more valuable and more important and more valued and wonder filled and worthy then of breaking and reworking, a deliberate use of rework there, a play on the words for Sabbath stuff, but to rework creation in order to offer something of hope to the man. But actually, I think he was also really annoyed that the religious leaders of the time were silent. And actually, it's not even that they were angry early on in chapter 3. It's that they were silent. It's chapter 3, verse 4. I think the thing that upsets Jesus the most is apathy.
Yes.
And I do wonder in our justice seeking whether, because everything seems so big and because we're not quite sure what we're able to say or not, that actually we're more pharisaical too. And so we rely on rules and boundaries in a way that actually means that we stop caring and we stop noticing those moments where God can bring transformation, those glimpses and glimmers of grace and hope that prioritize, in this case, somebody with a life-limiting condition. And instead, we just rely on our own ignorance and apathy.
And it shows Jesus, he's obviously angry. He's at his kind of, the end of his tether in terms of dealing with these holy Joes, as it were. And from here on, he's going to get himself into terrible trouble. But he wasn't put off by that. Fabulous, Joe. Well, I think our time has together has come to an end, unfortunately, because I really could listen to you expose the truths of the Bible all day, but
Oh,
we
bless you.
can't do that. But thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your insights. I hope they'll be valuable to our listeners. If you've enjoyed this, please do leave a review and do please share it with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on X or Twitter, if you like, at public issues or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit. We also have a Facebook group which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. So on that, Joe, thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to seeing you very soon, I know. But goodbye for now.